We got Zoro versus Ryuma. Zoro versus Ryuma is another, One Piece anime battle. And I'm not talking about Ryuma. That was on to the bark. That's not the same guy. I mean the guy who was in the movie. You know, Monsters, 103 Mercies, Dragon Damnation. That Ryuma, the sword god Ryuma, god of the blade Ryuma. Right? We know him to be the best samurai to ever come out of Wano. Right? That's where they're gonna be fighting. They're gonna be fighting in Wano. They'll be fighting in the flower capital. Zoro's a descendant of Ryuma, but he's a three sword style because he was born in Shimushiki village, which is in the East Blue. People from Wano came to the East Blue, some years, before that. His father, Arashi, was killed by a pirate. That's all we know about that. That's why I'm not doing Zoro versus Arashi. I'm doing him versus his ancestor. You know, that's through his grandmother, right? His grandmother was Shimutsuki. His grandmother on his dad's side was Shimutsuki, like Ryuma. Live Ryuma versus Zoro, current Zoro. Zoro, I do believe he's stronger. The man has to literally, carry those swords in his hands. And I'm not saying Ryuma's weak, but I think Zoro is definitely physically stronger than Ryuma. Not by a wide margin, but he is. You know, that gorilla pump thing that he does, boom, boom, that actually, increases his strength, right? Speed, I think Ryuma got the edge there. Less swords, so he can move quicker. He can throw out more attacks than Zoro can, right? You know, durability, I'm giving that shit to Zoro. Typically when somebody's fast, not always, they might lack that, toughness, that, armor, natural armor. It's hard to damage him, right? I think Zoro, he's not hard to damage, but I think it would be harder to damage Zoro than Ryuma. And then when it comes to endurance, staying in a battle for a long period of time, to try to catch that win, if you have to, be in a long drawn out fight because your opponent likes to, play games or, you don't want to or, whatever. Your opponent's just that tough. Zoro has the ability to stay in that fight long. Cuts, bruises, don't matter. He's gonna, power through that shit. Now, when it comes to intelligence, I got Ryuma with that. Ryuma, I don't think he was the smartest man in the world, but he was pretty, smarter than Zoro. He could, he could get to places, right? And Zoro, he can get to places too, but, not as much, not as easy. Um, Experience goes to Ryuma. He has the experience of how to turn a blade black in a sword permanently, not just for the fight, but permanently. Even when he's in resting mode, the black blade Chusui was black, and it became a national treasure to Wano, right? Close skills go to Ryuma. More swords does not mean better. I already made a video about that shit in Naruto, right? Ryuma and Zoro, I do believe that Ryuma has better swordsmanship, but not by a lot. He just has more experience and he's that guy, right? By the end of One Piece, Zoro, this fight will be different. Range skills go to Zoro. Recoup also goes to Zoro. With the hacks going to Ryuma. Better armament hockey. Observation hockey, It's probably, they're probably on par there. And Conquer's hockey. Environment will go to Ryuma because he's from Wano. Zoro ain't from there. And with all that being said, Ryuma wins that fight. High to extreme difficulty. Be cool, Kwa, on the corner, and let me know what you think about that in the comments below.